Hello and welcome back. Because spring is coming around the corner and it's going to be gardening season again soon, I thought I would make a video about some of the theory behind making plant cuttings, as well as tips and tricks that I find are useful to getting cuttings to root. So, the first question that you probably should ask if you're not at all familiar with this topic is, what is a cutting? So, what is a what is a cutting? And the answer to this is that a cutting is a piece of a fully grown plant that has been separated from the adult or cut off as a way of getting an identical copy of the plant. So it's a means of cloning. So cloning by removing branches. Now, the reason behind this, or the reason that this works, is because when animals are growing, we only have cells that can do more than one thing when we're embryos. So, animal stem cells, or animal pluripotent stem cells, pluripotent here means that it can differentiate into more than one cell type. Usually exist only when they're very small. In plants, however, they have the really fascinating adaptation where any cell from an adult plant can turn back into a embryonic stem cell type and then can grow an entirely new plant. So, in theory, any plant cell, any single cell can grow a new plant. But that only is in theory. In practice, there's a large number of complications such as genetic factors, hormonal factors, environmental factors, all of which can make it so that a plant cell does not, in fact, grow a new plant, which is why making a cutting requires a bit of decision-making as to exactly what part of the plant you're going to take for the cutting. So, the first thing you're going to want to look for is a node. So, if you have a plant stem here, this part is where the new leaves are growing out of, and then you have a leaf here, and a leaf down here. The leaves emerge from points called nodes, which would be here. While it's not always the case, most plants you will need to have the bottom of your cutting be a node section, because for the most part plant cells are only willing to differentiate and turn into roots and so on if they start from a node. There are some species that can make roots from the middle of this, but those exist in a minority, and there are other plant species where you only need one node because each node has its own root coming out of it, but those tend to be tropical climbing plants, and those are also minority. So to repeat, in general, cutting needs at least two nodes, where you have one node for the top where the plant can continue to grow, and you have one node at the base where the roots will emerge from. The reason for this is that there is meristem tissue in the nodes, which is undifferentiated and is prepared to grow into whatever structure the plant needs when it wants to survive. Another factor to consider is which sorts of branches you're going to want to use for it, because not all plants are made equally. So, in some cases, if the plant has multiple branches, with their own leaves growing out of them, the branch that you're going to want to take for a cutting is the higher branch, because since it's higher and it's probably growing more actively due to exposure to the sun, there will be more growth hormones inside this branch than inside this one. So a cutting on this plant I would take from up here. But that's not always the case. So in some plant species, you want to take a branch that is still green and soft. Soft tissue branches that are both easier to cut, but also, because they haven't matured yet, the immature tissue can grow roots more easily. But in other cases, you want a mature and woody branch because the immature one will probably rot away, and the mature woody branch is capable of surviving longer. There are also factors to consider regarding the season, because while in tropical plants they tend not to care all that much about whether it's summer or winter, except if it's a wet or dry season thing, plants in temperate climates do care about this sort of thing. For example, grapevines, you want to make a cutting of those in the spring, right before they start growing their leaves out. If you make the cutting elsewhere, they're not going to be ready to make a sudden burst of growth, and because they're not expecting to do this, they will not be able to put roots out. So, for grapes and other plants of similar structure and relation, cuttings are best taken in the spring. There are other plants where cuttings are best taken in the fall, and then there are some plant species where cuttings should not be taken at all because they are not prepared for this sort of thing to happen. I'm trying to think of examples of that, but you can tell from the structure of a plant whether or not cuttings are going to work usually. So, once you've selected your branch and the kind of plant you want to make a cutting of, then you have the question of rooting medium. So, you can find on YouTube and other social media sites where people just have a simple empty cup full of water, and they put the cutting in it like this, put it in a sunny spot, and after about a week or so, the cutting will have roots. While this does work on some plants, it is far from universal. So, in other cases, you have a flower pot, and it's going to be full of dirt, and then you put the cutting inside the dirt, and after that happens, the cutting might take root. However, you need to make sure that this dirt is sterile. So sterilize the dirt. Because if it's not sterile and you put an open wound at the base of the cutting inside, bacteria and stuff will get in and the plant will not make it. There's also the method where they spray mist or water droplets. So they have a lid of a container with a mesh pot in it, and water will shoot up from the bottom. And the reason why this one is used is because it provides a lot of oxygen for the roots. When the stem cutting is underground, it obviously cannot photosynthesize without any light, so it isn't producing oxygen for itself, and by providing oxygen in an open air environment, which is called aeroponics, you can encourage the root growth to occur very quickly. In some cases, it allows the plant to root in half the time, if not a third, and in other cases, a plant simply will not root at all in conditions other than aeroponics. And then, lastly, there is the moss method, where you have a pot and it will be full of sphagnum moss. And then you put the cutting inside. And the advantage of sphagnum moss is that it holds a lot of water, and it's acidic enough that bacteria won't usually grow in it. And also, it allows a ton of oxygen through, so it sort of provides a low-maintenance version of this, where the plant will be able to take root without being harassed too much. However, there is one major disadvantage of sphagnum moss, where it's not usually harvested sustainably, so I would recommend don't do this unless you have the moss already for unrelated reasons. So, after you've decided on your rooting medium, then you have to ensure a way that you can make sure that the cutting will not dry out. Because obviously if a cutting has no roots yet, it cannot pick up water very easily. So this is the top view of the plant. You have a leaf here. Come on, focus please, thank you. You have a leaf here, here, and here. Then you have a bunch of little leaves that haven't really formed yet. In this case, if you're going to plant in a cup of water, this is fine because the complete area of the cut piece is in water, and it can get water at complete efficiency. But if you're planting in any other medium, you should slice the big leaves like this, cut them half off, because if you cut them off like this, they need less water to survive, and this will buy them time until they can get their own roots growing. You may also choose to cover them, or you can put them in a darker environment for a little while, where they won't be transpiring as much, so the process of a plant losing water through its leaves is called evapotranspiration. And in higher humidity by covering it, or in cooler climates, excuse me, by putting them somewhere that's less hot, they will evaporate less water, and if they are evaporating less water, they will need less. So that's another thing to consider. Then there's, how do I put this? Some people also will prefer to spray plants with like mist and stuff like that on the tops, because once again the mist serves to increase the humidity a little bit, and by increasing the humidity they can reduce the rate of transpiration. Now the last factor to consider here is temperature. At higher temperatures, because plants are not usually warm-blooded, I'll get to an exception in a later video. Higher temperatures mean that their metabolism goes up, and if their metabolism goes up, their cells divide faster and they can get roots more easily. So it's common for some sort of heating mat to be placed with cuttings in pots like along the top of it, because if it's heated cuttings root easily. So I've noticed sometimes 2 or 3 times the difference, so it could be as quick as 7 days with heat, but if it's cold, it could be up to a month of time it takes for cuttings to root. So now that we've discussed a little bit about the theory behind cuttings, we can look at plants that we might want to take a cutting of. Alright, so now that we're in the proper grow area, I can show you a couple of plants and we can take a look at what would be good for cuttings. So here we have a crown of thorns here, Euphorbia millii, succulent from Madagascar. So regarding their nodes, you can see each set of these spikes here comes out from a node point. So there are many places on this plant where you could take a cut from and it would probably work. However, it has fairly thick stems, and as a result of this sort of succulent nature, you're going to want to let the cutting sit and dry out for about 2, 3, maybe 4 days, so that it doesn't get infected when you put it in dirt. Now, this particular branch here is probably too far low, so you can see, tracing it back, it emerges from the base of the plant, which means that because this one isn't actively growing as much, this one would take much longer to root than it would if it was from a higher branch. So going up a little, you can see these branches here. They're smaller. That means that they're probably going to root faster because it's newer. And I would take a cutting from here if I wanted to clone this plant. This is a tropical species, and so the time of the year really doesn't matter too much. The flowers here would have to be removed because it takes energy for plants to maintain flowers, and you really don't want the plants to be spending extra energy when they haven't taken root yet. For this thing over here is a jade plant. These are one of the plants that does not require a node to be able to produce cuttings, so I could simply take this leaf, pull it off, and if I left it on the soil surface, it would be able to take root quickly. So it doesn't matter where in the plant it is. These are very, very prolific. Now I'm going to show you some plant that's actually a surprisingly good example of what to take cuttings from, but not something I probably should right now. Give me a second. So, here we are with the Gimpy once again. As you can see, it is taller than the thing I was just showing you, so it's about maybe 4.5 feet right now. But anyway, this is the main stem, and would not be good to make a cutting off of, because as you can see inside, it's fairly thick, woody stem, not a good place. This branch lower down, that might work, but even this stem is fairly thick, so I think if I were to cut, it probably wouldn't work. And even so, I would have to take a slice here, drag across that leaf, slice right about there, and I would have to remove this leaf from the bottom and the other ones too. So this leaf would have to go, this would have to go, and this damaged one down here would have to go. Now, there is another branch over here, which, once again, isn't a particularly good place for it. So, while you normally want to make sure you're taking branches that are thinner and from higher up on the plant, that isn't always viable. So, if I were to make a cutting of this, actually, I would take a branch from lower down. As you can see, there's a couple there. I'm not going to reach for them because they're kind of nestled in there, and if I messed up, I'd get the heck stung out of me on camera and say some words I probably shouldn't be saying. So I'm not going to physically point them out, but that dead leaf is obstructing one from the camera's view right now. Maybe if I go a little bit like this, I can... yeah, there they are. So those two branches down below, even though they're slower growing, because they're not in the sun, they are still better for the purposes of making cutting, because they're less likely to get infected. Now, the Gimpy or Dendronidae moroides is extremely easy to make cuttings of. A broken branch will root in just plain water after somewhere between 5 and 10 days, and it can be planted in soil almost immediately without any sort of acclimatization period. I believe that tropical rainforesty plants in general tend to root faster like that, just because it's probably advantageous in the wild that if it's wet enough, a broken piece should be able to take root, because they probably sustain broken pieces quite often. Although I would like to iterate, this is purely speculation and should not be taken as a sign or as scientific information, because it's not. It's just a trend I've noticed and educated guesstimate about why I think it's happening. Now, for plants like this, making the cutting doesn't require any sort of rooting powder, but I will now show you something that does. So once again, I have to cover the camera. So, this here is a fairly common rooting hormone used. You pour a little bit out onto a piece of paper, and then you tap the cut end of your cutting directly into it. You really don't want to use all too much though, because it'll get the plant all sorts of confused, and if it's too confused it won't be able to make any roots. So, while a little bit of this is better than none, too much of this is the worst case of all, and you'll probably not get a cutting out of it. So, this sort of thing is required for many different types of plants. The plants like the Gimpy that don't need it seem to be relatively unusual, although, being honest, they are fairly common as houseplants. Like most of your common houseplants won't need any of this auxin stuff to be needed. So, move that out of the way. And here we have some cuttings that I took about a week ago. Or sorry, not a week ago. 4 weeks ago. Now, probably done. As you can see, I have them covered in this plastic bag. Gonna remove that. Then if you look in carefully, you can see that they are rooted in sphagnum moss. And these ones have been making flowers. I cut the flowers off before I put the cuttings in, but these plants are quite uncooperative. So as you can see, they are continuing to add flower buds despite the fact that I tried to make sure they weren't going to be doing that. I believe it slowed them down when they're rooting because most of their relatives do tend to root relatively quickly after about 2 weeks or so, but these hadn't yet by 2.5. I'm not sure if they have it now. I can't tell you what they are because it's rare enough that it would immediately reveal who I am. That's not the kind of thing I want to be doing, doxing myself on YouTube. But, and also you can clearly see that I hadn't cut their leaves off because, once again, they were covered in a plastic bag, and that would vastly increase the humidity inside the little chamber there. Now, the problem with using a plastic bag is that when they're used to such a high humidity environment, you're going to get an awful lot of water coming up out of these leaves when they're no longer in that environment. So, while you either have to watch them very carefully to make sure they're not wilting, or you have to introduce them to less humid environments, only maybe half an hour at a time, putting the bag back on as soon as they wilt. So, I have some pots here. There are 3 cuttings in this sphagnum pot, and I have 3 pots. Hopefully, they'll have rooted. So, being very gentle here, so as not to damage any roots that exist. I'm gently moving the moss out of the way, lifting, and here we go. The camera would focus on that, please. Thank you. So as you can see, this largest one has taken root. So I'm going to move this out of the way, bring up the pot, very carefully here, make a little hole, and then simple as that, it has rooted. Now, you want to make sure it doesn't fall over, so it should probably be standing a little bit more upright than that. Once again, don't push it more than you have to, and I'll be watching this guy very, very carefully to make sure that it doesn't end up collapsing now that it's no longer in its highly humid environment. It should be able to take root fairly quickly, though. I didn't put it too deep because the stem would rot if I did. And hopefully now that it goes into a warmer environment, it will grow the rest of its roots quickly. So, smaller cutting. Let's see. As you can see here, smaller cutting does not have roots yet. So we're just going to dig a little hole for that. Yeah, put it back in. And now this cutting, very gently so as not to damage anything. Lift it up. And what do you know? This one does have roots. So this one also graduates into a small pot here. So once again, moving the soil out of the way, putting the cutting in, and packing it back down. Sorry about that. So, these 2 plants here, that's 2 cuttings that I made earlier that are now complete, and I will be able to put them into a bright grow light area as soon as they're ready for it. I'm actually kind of surprised here though, because this little guy here and the one that hadn't rooted yet were from higher up on the plant, and were younger cuttings than this large one here that rooted first. So, due to that, I think it's probably some weirdness, or perhaps from where they came from on the very, very large plant that they were taken from. I think that perhaps the larger branch had more nutrients in it, and was able to root faster, while the smaller ones were delayed slightly because they had to save up the sugars from the light. Thank you for watching. I hope the video was informative enough that those of you who are making cuttings of your own for the season will be able to do so with a higher success rate than you had before. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.